Welcome to the Nick Halaris Show. This is the place where we explore big ideas with people having a big impact on our world. I'm your host, Nick Halaris, serial entrepreneur, author, early morning riser, and seeker of truth and wisdom. Join me as we explore the journeys and discoveries of fascinating people who are literally unlocking the secrets to creating a life of both success and fulfillment. Each episode will arm you with insights, ideas, and practical perspectives on what it takes not only to be financially and personally successful, but also how to start having authentic impact on the world around you. Hey everybody, and welcome back to the Nick Halaris Show. Our guest today is Scott Epstein, who is the policy director for Abundant Housing LA, one of the most interesting advocacy groups or activist groups here in Los Angeles, and super excited to have Scott on the show. Thanks for being here.
Pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me, Nick.
I figured we could start this conversation with a topic that is very familiar for listeners of the Nick Halaris Show, which is housing.
Yeah.
You're living and breathing housing policy every day.
Yeah.
So it's kind of a broad question, but why don't you just tell us, like, what is abundant housing and what are you focused on? What are you trying to accomplish?
Sure. So we are a nonprofit advocacy organization that works across LA County and the state as well. We are advocating for a comprehensive approach to housing reform in the city and the state to bring abundance and equity. So we take we sort of focus, some organizations just focus on renter protection or just this policy. We kind of take the broad view. So we have 4 pillars, which includes building more homes, zoning for more homes, building those homes more quickly, increasing public subsidies for homes, and enacting robust renter protections. So we think that you kind of have to do all of those things to solve this very deep housing crisis in California.
Yeah. And I want to get into those 4 pillars, but maybe just take a step back because I want to get your opinion. Like, housing is obviously a problem and everybody knows about it. But it's one of these crazy problems where, similar to homelessness in LA, where for decades, right, we know that homelessness is a problem, yet nothing happens.
Yeah.
How in the world did we end up in the most prosperous nation in human history with a housing crisis? Like, what's your view of this?
My view is it's a political failure. So that is tied to a certain thinking around how we design communities, tied very much to sort of an automobile culture that came to be in the latter half of the 20th century. I think what happened was we started suburbanizing and sort of adopting an ideology that everything should be in its place. Sort of housing is here, and work is here, and commerce is here, and we shouldn't mix any of those things. That came out of car culture. It also came out of the late 19th century when cities did have a lot of problems. It's no longer a model that makes any sense. It's probably not a model that never made any sense. But I think it instilled in folks the notion that communities are sort of stuck in stone. They shouldn't change. And so for folks that are used to the idea that, we shouldn't have apartments next to single family homes, or we shouldn't have restaurants within walking distance, it feels like an attack on their way of life. And for decades now, we've had a slow growth movement that was quite successful that fought against any additional density in Los Angeles and in a lot of cities across the country. And we had politicians that listened to them. And year after year made decisions that made it harder and harder to build the housing we so desperately need. You mentioned homelessness. Our housing and homelessness crises are the same crisis, basically. There's been rigorous empirical research that shows that homelessness is not a mental health problem. Homelessness is not, the root cause of homelessness is not mental health or drug abuse. People have those problems. Those problems have to be addressed. Those are real policy problems, but they're not housing problems. In places that have abundance and have planned and built for abundance, those folks are not living on the streets. They might be living in single room occupancy. They might be in different kinds of housing arrangements, but they're not in tents on the street. So this is something that we have to turn around now.
Yeah. I want to talk about abundance in a second, so don't let me forget that follow-up question with this question, though. I kind of agree. I completely agree with you that it is a political failure. And my question for you is, having engaged in this for quite some time now, do you think that the slow growth NIMBY movement that has captured for sure the attention of politicians across the country, do you think it's the actual majority? Like, where do you see it?
No, I mean, we have strong survey research to suggest that it is not. I mean, here in LA, there's been plenty of surveys that show that people want more housing, that they want more transportation. We also have, probably the best evidence is how people have expressed their values in the voting booth. So, and Angelinos have expressed it over and over again, that they want a city with abundant transit and abundant housing through Measure M, R, H, HHH, J, JJ, ULA. You can argue about some of the policy details of those things, but the message from voters is very clear. We need bolder change to, make sure that this is a city that works for everyone. So, that political movement is very much at odds. That slow growth movement is very much at odds at this point with public opinion. And many politicians are still at odds with public opinion, although that is shifting. We're seeing a dramatic shift in the state legislature towards pro-housing policies, and growing power of this movement. So
yeah, I started thinking about that, and I think last year at some point wrote an article about how there's this crazy dichotomy or dynamic in LA and California where the elected officials representing neighborhoods at the state level are like busy passing all these pro-housing laws.
Yeah.
But in the same neighborhoods, the elected officials who are representing the same people essentially at the city council level are kind of siding with the anti-development crowd in many cases. And my theory on it at the time, this is like, I'm trying to remember exactly what I wrote about it, but my theory on the time was that the city council members are essentially just responding to the loudest, most annoying voices that come across their desk, where the folks in Sacramento are like actually thinking and trying to express the will of their constituents in a broader sense. What do you think of that?
I think there's some truth in that. Yeah, I mean, I think there's like some political realities going on. I mean, if you look at like the LA City local context, until recently, the city voters adopted an amendment to the charter to have elections in even years. This was a very big deal because it increases voter turnout a lot. So you get a much more representative sample of the overall population in a district now than you ever did before. In the past, when it was happening in odd years, off the cycle of congressional and presidential elections, you could have like 12% of voters or something voting. And those folks are going to be disproportionately higher income, more affluent, more white, older. And so you had council members really reflecting the values of a small slice of the population and the slice that didn't want change on housing and transit. So that is shifting now. But I would say locally, many politicians are still behind the curve on that.
Yeah, that's a good point. Like, I'm trying to remember the exact numbers, but I remember being just like astounded by the fact that Garcetti's first mayoral victory came with like 500,000 votes or something like that.
Yeah.
And how many voters are in LA City? Like 4 million or something like that?
Yeah.
It's crazy that few people are engaged in the mayor's race of this place.
Totally. He won in a landslide in his reelection, but it was a landslide of a tiny fraction of the
like hundreds of thousands.
The population.
Yeah. And this last election, which you ran in, was that was on the new schedule, right?
It was.
And what was the turnout like?
The turnout was considerably higher. And I think you saw the results of it. Actually, for the most part, there were exceptions, but the trend in local elections was towards a much more progressive electorate, and the more progressive candidates in most of the races won, whether that was Mayor Bass or Katie Arslowski, rather than Sam Yebri in the race that I ran in. It was it wasn't maybe as big of an increase as some of us would have liked, but it was marked and it had a real impact.
Yeah, like in the results.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting. Well, I want to switch gears now and talk about abundant housing and the definition of abundance.
Sure.
Just to share my sort of personal experience with it. When I first decided to do some development around town, I went to some local meetings. I live in West Hollywood. And so I went to some meetings on the LA side of West Hollywood. And it was, typical. The first part of the meeting was a typical LA meeting, in my opinion, where the public comment open. This was for a plan, like a 6-story building or something in that area at the time. This was 2017 or maybe 2018. And all the NIMBY neighbors came out and talked about how this was going to ruin the neighborhood, the traffic, and their crazy theories. Essentially, it's like traffic, and nobody wants to say racist and classist things, so they make up other things, but they're really trying to say like, hey, I don't want dense housing in my neighborhood because I'm afraid of poor people, or I don't exactly know why they're doing that. But then this group of people showed up who were on the other side, and it was early sort of abundant housing members who were saying, well, wait a second, let's talk about the positives of this development.
Is this the car wash development?
Yeah.
I was involved in that.
That's crazy. What a small world. Okay, so I'm sitting there, I'm like, this is interesting. And it turns out that I looked into it and I sort of knew through a friend of a friend, Brent Gaisford, who was kind of one of the early players in abundant housing. So that's how I get introduced to you all.
That's fascinating because I was pivotal in that happening. So so I was the chair of Mid-City West at that point, and which is the neighborhood council that project was being proposed in. So that I was chairing that meeting that you came to.
That's crazy.
So I first joined in 2012 and quickly found out a lot of people on this council do not agree with me on housing and transportation and things like that. I started organizing and ran, over the course of my time at Mid-City West, I ran 3 slates of candidates that completely changed, that were extraordinarily successful and completely changed the culture of Mid-City West into a very pro-housing, pro-transit neighborhood council, perhaps the most so in the city. But that project, and we were as I became the chair, when that project, we had started to basically vote yes on all of these mixed-use projects. But that one, which was right on the border of Mid-City West and West Hollywood, adjacent to the West Hollywood West neighborhood, which is the lowest density and probably most anti-housing part of West Hollywood. We were getting like a lot of opposition letters from those folks that were really upset about this project. And I had started to develop relationships with Abundant Housing LA. I had won a scholarship to go to the first NIMBY town conference in Boulder and had met some of the folks like Brent and Josh Stevens and Jason Islas. And Abundant Housing at that point was an all-volunteer group. And I thought, I think I need some cover for this project. I need some pro-housing voices. So I reached out to them and said, I think this is a project that you guys could really get behind. It would be great if some pro-housing voices would show up. And they did, they scheduled it, and they had it's a great urban location, so they had like a happy hour before or after, and they showed up in force. It was the first time I ever saw Nick Burns speak. It was the first time I ever saw Leonora Kamner speak, who ended up being my boss. And they were tremendous. It helped provide that balance And the council was already very pro housing at that point, so they voted for the project. But it was really beneficial. So it's really funny that
what a small world.
Yeah.
Even smaller world is that I ended up buying right on the border. Literally, my house is adjacent to that car wash. I bought an old hot property and developed my own house there. So now I live in Mid-City West.
Wow.
And I know those neighbors.
Yeah.
I'm friends with them who are very anti that project. Like, just crazy.
Yeah.
But it was inspiring at the time because it kind of woke me up to the fact that there are people out there, one, who care about this, which I sort of already knew, but two, who would come out on like a Tuesday night or whatever night it was, and get up and say something about it. It was like a great example of what is possible inside of democracy when people care and are willing to put themselves out there. And it changed the whole dynamic of that room. Because up until then, it would have been like literally a parade of, I hate this project. And the architecture sucks. The balconies, there's going to be parties on the roof. There's environmental damage, blah, blah, blah. Like the whole
all
list.
Of the talking points.
And then the abundant housing crew came up and they're like, well, let's actually talk about this project a little bit. And they knew the details and it was intelligent discussion. So, Hey guys, this is Nick. I wanted to take a quick break from the episode to share some exciting news. In addition to the podcast, I want to make you aware of some additional content we're putting out. And best of all, it's 100% free. Our Profit Plus newsletter consists of weekly insights about what it takes to find meaning in the pursuit of modern success. This is the place where we explore big ideas at the intersection of markets, business, politics, and life as we seek to empower our readers to have an authentic impact on the world. If you're serious about finding fulfillment amid success, then definitely check out these additional insights. Just go to subscribe.nickhalaris.com. Again, that's subscribe.nickhalaris.com. Now let's get back to the episode. My question out of all that was, describe what abundant housing does day in and day out now.
Yeah, so abundant housing does a lot of things. So we are a 501c3, which is our education arm. We are a 501c4, which is the more political lobbying, legislative lobbying arm. And we have a PAC. So we do policy work. I manage that. So policy research and policy development and advocacy on all sorts of things, local and state. We actually are starting to do state legislation. We ran our own bill last year. And then we do a lot of on-the-ground organizing. So we have a 4-person organizing team with folks focused on geographic areas all throughout the county, overseeing local chapters. We have over 20 local chapters with volunteers that are doing the kind of pro-housing advocacy we were just talking about. We do public education, so we run a pro-housing leadership course. We do all sorts of events that educate the public around housing. And we do politics. So we endorse candidates, and our PAC gives small amounts of money, runs small independent expenditure campaigns on behalf of candidates that we support. So it's really sort of a comprehensive suite of pro-housing actions that we do.
Nice. And of those 3 sort of buckets, like where do you think you're having the most success or the most impact?
I mean, I think I think these things all work together, right? So, the endorsement, like we need elected officials to carry things and to feel accountable to pro-housing voices. So the politics piece is really important. And then, my policy team and our organizing team work hand in hand because I can write the most beautiful policy letter. But if we don't have 30 voices in the room, when the executive directive 1 staff hearing comes saying, wait a second, you didn't make sure that this is implemented in a way where we can continue this policy and its effectiveness, then the job is not going to get done. So it's that magic kind of secret sauce of all of those things together that makes it work.
That makes sense. Yeah, because I see so many groups focus on the intellectual side of it, which needs to be done. Like the policy work needs to be done, but then the end result is a report.
Yeah.
And democracies don't function via report. They
Yeah.
function at the ballot box and in the inboxes and inbound phone booths of elected officials who hear from their constituents.
100%.
Yeah. So it makes sense. So I guess here's a fun thought experiment. Let's say you were given sort of unilateral dictatorial control over housing policy in California. How do you solve the housing crisis?
Oh gosh. So I think a few things come to mind. One is we have a big movement in the state, locally, and across the country to make more housing by right, which basically means a city planner looks at the project, sees if it checks all the boxes, and if it does, you get your entitlements. That's a very different process from a discretionary process where you might have to go to a city planning commission. You might have to go to a planning and land use committee, to the full council. Yeah. You have all sorts of opportunities for folks to say no, for angry public comment, and pivotally for lawsuits, which could slow down the process for years and inflate the costs. So we're seeing a dramatic effect locally, for example, with the mayor's executive directive 1, because she said, you have a 100% affordable project. It's not going to go through that gauntlet of hearings. It's not going to be prone to CEQA lawsuits. You're going to get your entitlements in 60 days, guaranteed. So that's one piece. If California could make much more housing by rights, it would be tremendously impactful. Another thing.
Can I stop you on that just for a second? Because I think it's an interesting idea and one that a lot of people like. When you think about the zoning codes across the city or across the state, like, to what extent would we have to go by right in degree for this to have an impact? Meaning, like, it's one thing to say, like, by right to build whatever the current zoning is, but do you think that in and of itself is enough? Or?
Well, we have other tools that help, that work in harmony with the by right. So, like, what made ED1 locally so effective was the combination of the local streamlining and the state's density bonus program, for the most part, which allows quite a bit more density on many multifamily parcels. And developers could ask for all these off-menu incentives to solve all sorts of problems in the zoning code. So that combination of, I'm going to get my entitlements in 60 days, and I can build a project that's big enough that can actually pencil, was tremendously powerful. And we saw basically like 10,000 units entitled in 1 year, which is kind of unprecedented. So yeah, it's not the only solution, but it's a powerful tool in combination with other tools.
Okay, that makes sense. All right, we'll keep going. So number 1 is by right.
Yeah, the other thing I would say is zoning reform.
Yep.
Particularly when as it relates to our most climate-friendly locations for housing. So we need to build a lot more housing near transit, but not just near transit, also near services and jobs. And our zoning just doesn't allow for that in a lot of places. I think in particular, I'm really excited about the notion of making sort of missing middle housing legal in those locations, which is like the housing that really built LA. The bungalow courts and fourplexes and courtyard apartment buildings and duplexes. They're really cheap to build. 1 to 2 story, generally of the same scale of lots of the neighborhoods that people are concerned might change. But they allow for a good deal of density. And it's cheap wood frame construction. So if we could scale up those sorts of buildings in the climate-friendly locations, that would be a very big deal. So you're seeing that policymakers do that kind of thing in a lot of places, whether it's Minneapolis, doing away with single family zoning, and the floor instead is fourplex zoning. Or Oregon has been very active in this kind of space too. I think that would be very powerful for housing production, but also housing equity, because we care about, you know, people being able to access the communities of their choice. And there's a lot of single family neighborhoods, low density neighborhoods that are proximate to transit and services and amenities and jobs, and are just basically putting a wall around those communities and not allowing diverse folks to enter them and be close to the things that they want to be close to.
Yep. Okay, so zoning and making things by right. Those are the two things you would focus on.
I would say those are the top two, and then the third that I would say is like reforms that allow the types of buildings that are there. There's two reforms, so parking reform and single stair reform, that I think allows us to build the most beautiful, livable multifamily housing, the kind of housing we see in a lot of European cities. So you're able to, with parking reform and single stair reform, you can build townhouses, you can build point access blocks with beautiful green space in the middle of the block, with family size units, and instead of small one bedrooms, where there can be light and air on both sides of the unit, where there's actually quality open space for folks to enjoy, even if you can't afford a single family home. I think those reforms, which we're seeing some real movement on in California and across the country, would be a huge deal for building kind of like a new urbanism that I think people would really respond to and would give folks like a really high quality of life.
Yeah, and for people not in the game.
Yeah, this is wonky. This is wonky.
What is the double? Is it the fact that you have requirement under ADA for 2 stairs?
That's yeah. So it's not. I don't think it's actually in the ADA.
Okay.
So it's not that. It's more about fire.
Fire. Oh, that makes
protection.
Sense. Yeah.
So most building codes in the United States require two points of ingress and egress. Functionally, what that creates is what we call like double loaded corridor buildings. It's sort of like your hotel format, right? You're going through down a hallway, you don't see any light, and on either side there are doors, and those doors go to apartments that have light on one side of them. There are cities around the world allow for only one staircase, and that allows you to create these smaller buildings that instead of a staircase in the back and the front, there's usually a staircase in the front by the sidewalk and an elevator. And cities, they create this kind of urban form for buildings 6 to 10 stories high. And the concern with the building codes in the U.S., the reason why we have these building codes is folks were concerned about fire safety and people being able to get out of the buildings. But it turns out that the single stair buildings that are built all around the world are not any less safe, probably more safe, because these building codes basically require in the U.S. is very large buildings, like the kind of mixed-use buildings that we see a lot in Los Angeles, right? Like a full block mixed-use building that might have like a courtyard or like a roof deck in the middle, but basically be parking underneath in these double-loaded corridors with light for on one side for the residents. It turns out if you have a fire in one of these buildings, it can spread around the whole building. Whereas the point access block model, they're smaller buildings that are just right next to each other that form kind of this block with this big, beautiful courtyard in the middle. And they have firewalls in between each of those small granular buildings. And so the fire can't spread past each small building. So it turns out the explicit purpose for these building codes doesn't really play out. evidentially. So this would be a big deal.
Okay, that's interesting. And the parking's a no-brainer. Like for those not familiar with LA, essentially, like if you have to do all the parking, a lot of times that means you're either going to build very expensive subterranean parking,
Yeah.
or a really ugly concrete above ground parking in places where you can actually get some height, which is hard to get in the zoning codes as is.
Right.
So that's a no-brainer. So that's interesting.
And it's very expensive. It increases the rents.
Yeah.
It's not pedestrian oriented. It also takes a lot of space. So if you're taking all that space for cars to go in and out of a garage, where are you going to put the open space that everybody wants?
Yeah. Yeah, and I feel like if you fast forward, you kind of have to take a leap of faith a little bit. But if you fast forward time a decade, let's say, the idea of individual car ownership might be like history, because there probably will be these automated vehicles all around town. Like even if we didn't have public transit, they're probably going to be automated vehicles that people can just use on demand, essentially. And so if you're thinking about the built environment, like, yeah, maybe we don't need a bunch of parking spots at every single apartment building that gets built in this town.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And we're already seeing that shift. Younger people are less interested in owning a car. They're using Uber, they're using bikes, they're using transit, they're walking. So it's happening already.
Yeah. What do you think of rent control?
So, I support abundant housing supports rent stabilization. I think it is a useful and successful policy to for one particular issue, which is keeping renters stable in their homes. Right, particularly in a world without abundance, being evicted is one of the major pathways to homelessness. And so keeping folks stable in their homes and it's also about keeping stable communities. We have relationships in our communities. We want the people that live in our communities, if they want to continue to live if they desire to continue to live in these communities, to be able to do so. And with the cost of housing going up so high because supply has not kept up because of poor political choices, people are really at risk. So it's an important policy. It's not going to fix the root causes of housing, of our housing crisis. It could never turn us around in that way. We need to build a lot more housing, but it is an important policy for the folks that are living in those homes.
Yeah.
And some folks have concerns about downside impacts of rent control on housing production, but the empirical research has not suggested that that's an issue.
My perspective on rent control is a little different maybe than yours. I own some rent control buildings, so I've kind of seen firsthand how it distorts the market. And what bothers me about that as a policy, I understand why the policy got put in place, because rents were going out of control, and local jurisdictions like a West Hollywood or LA, like they don't have huge revenue sources to draw from to, for example, do the smart thing, which would be to just subsidize people. That's, in my view, a much better policy than rent control. Like the problem is people can't afford the rent, so we should subsidize them rather than imposing a sort of penalty upon property owners.
Right.
But my problem with it from a sociological standpoint is that it's creating a system in a town like this where it's almost lottery-like.
Yeah.
And there are those who have it and those who don't.
Right.
And the way that this is manifesting in this town is that older people tend to be the beneficiaries of rent control.
Yeah.
And younger people just pay high rents to the developers who are trying to recoup the profits on their buildings from these that are rent control.
Yeah.
And so it's created this generational divide. Not only does it create this sort of lottery, like have or have not, you either get a rent control unit or you don't.
Yeah.
But it's also created this generational divide. And it's not, as you said, it's not actually going to solve this problem.
Yeah.
Like in my view, like what I'm pushing for, I'd love to get your take on this. What I'm pushing for on housing is that we We do all the things that you're suggesting. I agree with all of them. And then on top of that, let's just address the truth, which is that as of this moment, there's a bunch of people who can't afford the rent.
Yeah.
So let's develop a subsidy program.
Yeah, I mean, I think you make an excellent point. I mean, we definitely have a subsidy problem in this country. Section 8 is severely underfunded. We don't have nearly enough social housing in our country. There's a movement now to try to shift that. So I think that rent stabilization is a response to some major policy failures. That and I can also appreciate your point about the cross subsidies that are happening and the lack of equity. And there are people that benefit from this policy that could afford to pay more and probably should be. And they're getting a sweetheart deal. You know, there are some high income folks that have lived in a rent controlled unit for 30 years and they're paying very cheap rents. So I can appreciate all that. And I agree there are some inequities there, but I think from an empirical point of view, if you eliminated rent control in a major city in California, it would have very detrimental impacts. There would be a flood of folks into homelessness. And so, I think it's an imperative at this point, until a point at which, we have a lot more abundance, and then we can have a different conversation, perhaps.
What do you think? You mentioned that Section 8 is like woefully underfunded. Like, what have you quantified at Abundant Housing? What the gap is? Like, what does it need to be? What is it, and what does it need to be?
Well, housing organizations that have a much broader view I'm sure have done this work. It's a federal issue.
Yeah.
So, I don't have all the stats on the top of my head, but I will say I believe that it's something like an 8-year waiting list. Like that's a typical time that
here folks, in LA.
I think in the nation.
In the nation.
That folks wait for a Section 8 voucher to open up. So, I mean, there's probably, I don't know, hundreds of thousands at least folks waiting for a Section 8 voucher across the country, probably millions. I don't know.
I think it's got to be millions. Like,
yeah.
Last time I looked at it, the data was kind of confusing because in the COVID era, like they actually, through CARES Act and stuff, lots of money went into Section 8.
Yeah.
But the last time I saw like a pre-COVID number, I think it was like very modest. It's like 20 billion or something.
Yeah.
And just to put it into context, like we're spending that like per month in Ukraine.
Yeah.
Right? Like 20 billion is like a drop.
Yeah.
Compared to what we're doing, which is kind of crazy to think about, the fact that our entire Section 8, my number might be wrong, my 20 billion might be wrong, but it was of that magnitude.
Yeah.
It was either 20 or 50 billion or something.
Yeah.
And I participated actually in a study with some of my fellow civic activists that McKinsey did in 2019.
Okay.
And McKinsey tried to quantify the number for LA, and their number was 50 billion.
50 billion deficit in the needed public subsidy for housing.
Yeah.
I don't doubt it.
Yeah. It's amazing. It's a huge number. So if the national number, if I'm right about the national number being 20 or 50 billion.
It's tremendous.
Yeah.
It's tremendous. I mean, and LA we have probably the worst housing crisis in the nation because of the imbalance. I mean, the cost of housing paired with, we are not a rich city on average.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it's a big problem.
Yeah. Before we get to your definition of abundance, I want to ask one more question about policy, because I think it's super interesting, because it's something I see kind of happening beyond this place.
Yeah.
So for listeners' benefit, in LA, we passed what's called ULA, which was advertised to the public as a mansion tax.
Yeah.
And it's essentially like any property over 5 million gets taxed at 5%, like transfer tax.
Yeah.
But it also applies to commercial properties as well. So it's not just houses, even though it was called the mansion tax.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of controversy about it.
Yeah.
What's your take on ULA? Is it good policy or bad policy?
Well, Abundant Housing LA supported it. That was before I joined Abundant Housing LA. um, I think that the policy always should have exempted multifamily projects. I think the last thing that we need to do is place another tax on multifamily housing production. It's hard enough as it is. So I think there are some real challenges with ULA. And if I had my magic wand, I would make that fix.
Yeah, to keep ULA in place, but exempt like apartment buildings in particular.
Yeah, I mean, I think, yeah, I mean, I don't think that, I think we should, when we think broadly about taxation and increasing public revenue, it's a good thing to take a little extra money from folks that can really afford it, whether that be a billionaire's tax or a transfer tax on transfers when a single family home is being sold from one very wealthy person to another wealthy person. I think that's fair. It shouldn't impact the production of multifamily housing.
Yep.
That has a really, I mean, unnecessary and detrimental impact on our ability to deliver affordable housing for folks.
Yeah. I was in a room, to that point, I was in a room full of real estate CEOs like 2 months ago.
Yeah.
And to a person, they all reported that LA now has a giant black line. We don't invest in this area because of ULA. Because I think what the politicians and even the general public doesn't understand is that a 5% transfer tax is a meaningful hit on an investment property.
Yeah.
You look at these apartment buildings and you just assume like, oh, the people behind them are, making millions. But it's actually a very competitive game. It's tough for all kinds of reasons, like that we've talked about some of them in here. And just like to wipe 5% of the value off of it on a sale is actually very meaningful.
Yeah.
And so I'm hoping, this is another thing I'm putting out into the world. I'm hoping that Mayor Bass can come out and can understand this point and come out and be courageous and say, you know what, I agree with Scott. Let's take apartment buildings off the table. And I know she can't unilaterally do that, but at least, someone in her shoes could maybe influence the public. She's been so great on housing so far, and I would love to see her do that.
I would love that too. And I think, I'm having conversations with our members about how we might engage on this issue. I think there are different options, either legislative or by ballot, depending on how you structured it to fix some of these problems. So yeah, I'm looking forward to that conversation too, and would welcome the mayor's leadership on that.
Yeah, it would be huge because we can't have Wall Street. Like the feedback in that meeting is essentially the capital partners that are investing in these companies that the CEOs were running. They control the money, and they're like, we don't want you to invest in LA.
Yeah.
And these are literally the biggest builders of multifamily in the entire town.
Right.
And so that is a problem. We already have a housing problem. We can't have Wall Street putting a black box around LA and saying don't invest here.
Yeah. Yeah. We have to remove those unnecessary obstacles. And you're seeing with things like Executive Directive 1 how when you do that, the market does respond.
Yep.
Private developers do want to build even affordable housing.
Yep.
3/4 of Executive Directive 1 projects are being financed completely privately. No LIHTC funding stacks. It's just developers realizing if we can get our entitlements in 60 days, we can deliver a naturally affordable housing project. And we're willing to sign those covenants, those deed restricted units for many, many years. Because we can recoup our cost if we can actually have a much quicker and less risky process in delivering that housing.
Yeah, it's a success story. Yeah, for sure. Well, finally, to close out the housing conversation, tell me, what does abundance mean to you and your colleagues at Abundant Housing? I know you taught. The idea is relatively straightforward, but like, do you have a specific vision for this? How many? Is there like a metric behind it, or is it just let's just build as much as possible and see what happens?
Yeah, I mean, I think the notion is pretty simple. It is that we should have as much of this product as folks need of it.
Yeah.
Right? Like we think this way, I think, for a lot of basic needs. You know, we think there should be enough food for everybody who is hungry. I believe we think there should be enough clothing for every human that needs protection from the elements. And somehow on housing, there's this resistance that happens and say, oh, but not in my neighborhood, or that's not really the problem. The problem is something else. Greedy developers or whatever it is. But yeah, I mean, the notion is pretty simple. We need to build enough so that everybody has a home, and so that everybody has a home in the place where they want to have a home.
Let's take a quick break to hear from our sponsor. This episode of the Nick Halaris Show is brought to you by Metros Capital. If you're an investor looking for direct access to real estate investments, then we'd love to talk with you. Investment opportunities at Metros Capital balance financial returns and community impact. To learn more, contact us at metros.nickhalaris.com. Again, that's metros.nickhalaris.com. Now let's get back to the episode. And is there like a number? Like I see a lot of studies like looking at the median rent as a percentage of monthly income, and like LA is terrible. It's like 60% or something like that. But is there a number that you're targeting where it seems healthy is like 30% the number?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a reasonable threshold. You know, I mean, so if we could, if every Angelino could not be cost burdened according to the federal definitions, that would be a huge deal. And you'd need a lot more housing for that.
Yeah. Yeah, millions of, well, maybe not millions, but hundreds of thousands of units, right?
Millions,
yeah.
Yeah, millions in Southern California.
And what's the best annual peak year production? Is it like a couple 100,000 units?
It's been so slow for so many years.
Yeah.
You know, we basically haven't had an abundant housing production since the 1950s, 60s.
Yeah.
So you have to go pretty far back to find a year that was really great.
Like legitimate. Yeah, that's fascinating.
Yeah.
Interesting. All right. Well, there's another topic I want to get into with you with our remaining time, and that's just politics and civic engagement. Because you're someone who has quite an interesting story, an interesting journey, and an inspiring one because of just how it started and where you started and where you've come to and your vision. And I think it will be interesting and instructive maybe for you to just share your story because you came out of this crazy neighborhood council system in LA. Yeah. So maybe we start with that. Why don't you describe for listeners, like, what is the LA neighborhood council system?
Yeah. So the LA neighborhood council system is the largest, as Empower LA likes to say, it's the largest grassroots democracy system in the world. There are, I believe, 99 neighborhood councils across the city representing nearly every neighborhood. They are publicly elected advisory councils with small budgets. It was born out of the charter amendments process around the turn of the century. So at the time, a lot of folks in the Valley wanted to secede from the city. And that spurred this process to amend the charter and give some folks a little bit more local engagement and control. And that's what created the neighborhood council system. It was sort of like, okay, Valley, you'll have these neighborhood councils, you'll have more power. Some folks wanted the neighborhood councils to have more decision-making power on things like land use, but they ended up being advisory in nature.
Interesting. I didn't realize there's 99.
Yeah.
That's crazy. And how many do they all have the same number of people serving on them?
No. They have vastly different bylaws, including the number of the number of council members, and all sorts of other things.
Yeah. What's interesting about the neighborhood council system here is it points out like maybe the problem with democracy in a place like LA.
Yeah.
The fact that you need 99 neighborhood councils to give neighborhoods like a say in the city government. Just for context for people who are not from LA. LA has 15 city council members.
Yeah.
And there's 99 enough neighborhoods for there to be 99 neighborhood councils. So like the democracy is like kind of messed up here.
Yes.
Yeah.
So we have a big discussion around that now, and there's a lot of folks agitating for more council districts, which I think would be a good thing.
Yeah, like New York, I feel like they have a lot more. It's been I don't know the numbers. Like
New York is like something on the order of choice per capita of what we have.
Okay.
It's a bigger city.
Yeah.
But
so that would mean we would have 30. If we match New York, we'd have 30 council members.
Somewhere around 30 council members.
Yeah.
And each council member in Los Angeles has around 250,000 residents, constituents.
Yeah.
So that's a lot of folks to be accountable to.
Yeah. And when you compare it to other cities across the country, like each council person right now, council member, is like managing constituents that are massive compared to other jurisdictions across the country.
Yeah.
It's like crazy.
Yeah.
How big of a challenge it is.
Yeah.
So what drew you? Like, why did you get involved in that in the first place?
So, I had moved to Los Angeles with my girlfriend at the time, wife now, who wanted to go to film school here from DC, where I was going to grad school. And I sort of fell in love with urban living in DC, lived right in the heart of the city, and took subway and everything like that. And so I became really interested in transportation and urbanism. And, then I came to LA, and it took me a while to kind of wrap my arms around it, this place. But then as I started to pay attention more to what was going on in LA, I was like, oh, this is actually a really interesting time to be in Los Angeles. We moved here in 2007. And so there was a lot going on. There was like a burgeoning civic center. There was this biggest expansion of transit in the country. There was a lot of folks that were excited about active transportation. So I was reading Curbed LA and just getting to know all of this stuff and biking around and learning about the cities by biking around. And going to restaurants in different places and whatever. And I just kind of wanted to be a part of that. I'm a policy analyst by trade, so I'm interested in these things. So I went to one neighborhood council meeting in my neighborhood. I watched the council. I thought I could do this. And I ran. And I was lucky enough to run unopposed the first time. There were 5 candidates for the 5 seats in the category I was running for, and it just sort of snowballed from there. Within a year and a half, I was the chair of the council. I showed up to the executive board when they were assigning committees, and I said, I'm kind of interested in transportation. And they said, you want to be the transportation committee chair?
Nice. Yeah.
I said, okay.
Yeah.
So that was how it started for me.
That's interesting. Okay. So you won the very first time
I won the very first time. I was unopposed. So it was sort of the council it was sort of embarrassing. I think we had like less than 100 votes for the whole. At that point, we had the biggest council in the city. There were like 45 members of the city, 45 members of the council. And, less than 100 people even showed up to vote. So the council was flailing in a lot of ways. But I was able to enter. And get involved in issues that I cared about.
And what kind of issues come up in front of these councils?
So the bread and butter tends to be like your planning and land use stuff. That was really, the politics that created the neighborhood council system was all around land use. Yeah. And so what most councils are interested in is land use. So all of the major housing projects and other kinds of projects, conditional use permits for for alcohol, for restaurants and bars, all that kind of stuff tends to come before neighborhood councils. The big thing that I did as the chair of a neighborhood council was help reshift that thinking. I mean, we still did land use stuff. But I was interested in the neighborhood council being more proactive, and being more, interested in improving the committee and not just reacting to this or that. So under my leadership, we built a very strong transportation committee. We got very involved in homelessness. We led the homeless count for our area every year when that started. When LASA asked neighborhood councils to do that, we responded to that call to action. I created a conceptual plan for 2 bikeways through the community, which ended up attracting $1.3 million through through the LA City applying for Metro dollars. It's the first time a neighborhood council's ever accomplished something like that. So it was exciting, and the more that we did different things that members of the community cared about, that had kind of a snowball effect, because then it was like, oh, the neighborhood council is doing work on homelessness. They're hosting connect days so that unhoused folks can connect with services and get their basic needs met. I'm interested in that work. And all of a sudden you have this virtuous cycle of not just the folks that just care about I don't want that building on 3rd Street, but people that care about a host of different issues.
That's interesting. You mentioned that first election, the voting was like 100 people.
Yeah.
How did that evolve in that time period in which you were involved?
It increased every time as I was the chair of the council over those 4 elections. Until the last election that I was involved in was over 1,000 voters.
Nice.
And one of the higher vote totals in the city. The greatest driver of that increase was just having competitive elections. I mean, we did a lot of hard work within the council to promote the elections, and we were much more publicly engaged council. So that helped too. People knew about us because we were doing homeless counts, and we were doing, community bike rides and walks and town halls about street safety and a whole host of things. So a lot more people knew about us. But the other big driver was outside of the council. I was doing political work to recruit slates of progressive candidates on housing, transportation, homelessness, public safety. And all of a sudden, all of those old school folks had competition. And the groups had to elicit votes and run campaigns. And that was really the biggest driver of engagement and increase in turnout.
That makes sense. And on a land use issue, like let's take that building that we cross paths, obviously.
Yeah.
When you would make your recommendation, you would transmit a letter to the city council? How does that happen?
Yeah, it's an advisory vote. So yeah, we would basically just write a letter to the decision makers.
Yep.
To the Planning and Land Use Committee or the full council or the City Planning Commission, whoever the decision maker was.
Yep.
And zoning administrator.
And how often did the elected officials in those seats vote against your decision, your recommendation?
Some of the time. It was interesting. I mean, there were times where we were able to create the political cover for folks to vote for it. So our district, now Mid-City West is represented completely by CD5. In the past, it was represented by CD5 and CD4. But the majority was always CD5, which used to be Paul Koretz, who was very much a kind of reactive kind of decision maker when it came to land use. And so there were times when we would support a project, and if he didn't hear from enough voices of no, he would say, okay, the community supported, the neighborhood council supported, I'm going to support it too. And And then there were other times when a project would become a political hot potato, and Koretz felt like it was bad for him politically to support a project. So I can think of this Caruso affiliated project at La Cienega, which still hasn't been built, at the Loman site,
Yeah.
which Mid City West supported, and we did a lot of hard work putting together a really amazing package of public realm improvements surrounding the project that Caruso agreed to, which would, I'm confident, represent millions of dollars of improvements to that area. But the local homeowners association, which is now defunct, but used to be a real big NIMBY voice in the community, came out in opposition to the project, and they got Koretz's opponent in the city council race, Jesse Creed, to oppose the project. And all of a sudden, Koretz didn't support it anymore, wanted it to be shorter, and it became this whole thing.
Yep.
So,
And it's still it's still at vacant property.
well, it is still, it has not been built. I mean, they did get their entitlements. I think there was a lawsuit by whoever, maybe it was that homeowners association, which they lost. So the project is still moving forward, but it just was slowed down tremendously. I don't know. I mean, Caruso has a lot of money, so he can afford for a project like that to he's also owned that property. His dad owned that property.
Okay. Yeah.
So they've owned that property for a long time, so they don't have
their taxes are low.
Yeah, so they don't have a financial incentive.
Yeah.
They don't need to build it fast. I think it's more like he loves that project. He wants it to build it, and I think it will be built at some point. But for that project, I think it's probably not going to kill it. It's just going to slow it down. It's also ultra luxury. But for other projects, it could kill them, because they would just run out of money.
Yep. It's happening across the city right now.
Yeah.
All over the place.
Yeah.
Okay, so you were the chair of this council for quite some time, and then you decided to run for city council yourself. Tell me about that.
Yeah. So, I was just really inspired by what I was able to accomplish in Mid-City West. We were able to, not just the things we were able to accomplish, which were real, but also this culture that we were able to change. I met so many amazing people through that work, recruiting people to run for the neighborhood council that cared about the issues that I cared about. And I knew that if I didn't jump into it, there probably wouldn't be a candidate that shared my values. And so I started to think about it very early. I kind of considered jumping in 2017 when Jesse Creed ran against Koretz, but it was just sort of too early for me. And I also knew that would be an uphill battle because he was an incumbent.
Yep.
And so I knew, you don't get that many chances at this. And so there was an open seat. So I started preparing for it. And I wanted to run and I had a very specific idea about the reason I wanted to run, which was I wanted there to be a pro-housing, pro-transit, pro-care for our unhoused neighbors candidates. So that's why I ran.
Who was in the race with you? It was...
Yeah, so at the beginning there were 6 or 7 candidates. 4 made it. There were 4 major candidates basically that were able to get their petitions and get on the ballots.
Yeah.
So it was Katie Yaroslavsky, who had the most establishment support given her relation. She worked for Sheila Kuehl. Her father-in-law is Zev Yaroslavsky, so she had lots of connections to money and power through her own career and through her family connections. So she was sort of in that kind of establishment center left lane. There was a guy named Sam Yebri who was kind of running as the also a Democrat. All four of us are Jewish Democrats.
Yep.
But Sam kind of ran as the conservative in the race. More concerned about more conservative takes on public safety. He was endorsed by the police union. He was very resistant to reimagining public safety, and more conservative on housing and transportation and all that stuff, and very highly aligned, with the homeowner association NIMBY establishment, basically. Like
Okay.
that, they were he was their candidates. And he had some good ideas about governance reform, and he ran an impressive campaign, but he was ideologically very different than me. And then there was me. I was in it from almost the very beginning, and then a second candidate who was basically very ideologically similar to me, but just with a lot less experience, came into the race. Jimmy Biblars is a great guy, who grew up in the district and then got like a whole bunch of degrees from Harvard and came back and wanted to get involved. And he is also pro-housing, pro-transit, progressive on reimagining public safety and how we interact with our unhoused neighbors. So his profile was very similar to mine. He had less of the community connection and the experience, but maybe some more time and connections to money. He was able to raise more money than me. So that was a little bit unfortunate for the left in this race, because we basically split it. We had different advantages, and we split that vote. So we each got 10% of the vote. Katie almost won in the primary. She won like 49%.
Okay.
And Sam got like 31 or whatever it was. And so, if there had been one pro-housing progressive in the race, maybe that person could have given the conservatives a run for his money for that number 2 slot.
For like the runoff.
The runoff.
Yeah.
Yeah. There's a world where that might have happened.
Yeah.
Where, because I was close to getting some key endorsements. Like the LA Times named Katie and me as the top 2 candidates. I think, you look at that piece, you could imagine they were thinking that I was the best candidate, but just didn't have the best shot.
Yeah.
And so if we had been able to consolidate more support on the left around one candidate, there's a possibility we would have had more of a YIMBY council member. Katie Arslowski has done a good job. I haven't agreed with everything that she's done. But she's been solid in a lot of ways, and a huge improvement on Councilmember Koretz. She's championing an important interim housing project in Rancho Park, and withstanding the opposition of the NIMBY establishment and sticking to her guns on it. So I give her a great deal of credit for that, and her staff is excellent. And I think she's an important voice on the council. I haven't agreed with every one of her votes. But I think that this was actually an interesting race, whereas some of the other races on the West Side, like in CD11, were really crowded on the right. But this race, because of Jimmy and my presence in it, and because Katie was quite a good candidate as well on housing, it was actually crowded on the left. And we really saw a change in the conversation in this race that I think would not have happened if there weren't like real YIMBYs on the ballot.
Yeah, real pro-housing.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's interesting, like, to think about your characterization of that as left, because I feel like pro-housing, if you took a step back and you were to like poll people, like, if someone is pro-housing, are they likely to be Because pro-housing is in a sense like a pro-business thing, but it's so interesting that in a place like LA, that's considered a left position to be pro-housing, where the right is aligned with these NIMBY groups.
This is a big conversation, obviously, and there are folks that are on the left on pretty much every issue, other than housing, that oppose new housing. My view is being pro-housing is a progressive policy because it is the means by which, in harmony with other important policies like renter protection, we deliver affordability for folks. So I think we need to, there's just a rigidity of thinking, I think, around this issue among certain folks. It reminds me a bit about, on the right in our country, we have a ludicrous rigidity around the use of government for good. There are a lot of conservatives who think like the government can't do any good. This comes out of Reagan, and government is the problem, which is an absurd notion, right? And now we're seeing with housing sort of the inverse of that, which is the private market can do no good, and any policy that might help unleash the private market for good is by its nature, because of the tool you're using, it's not progressive. In my view, it's the result.
Yeah.
The goals of our policies and the results of our policies are what we should be using to measure how progressive or not we are.
Yep.
And I believe in regulation, even in the housing market. I do. But not all regulations have progressive results.
Yeah.
And it shouldn't be a ridiculous thing to say that. And you shouldn't be called trickle-down development shill Reaganomics person just by saying, this particular regulation, it was actually adopted for exclusionary purpose, which is regressive, not progressive.
Yeah.
It was adopted to prevent housing in places like Westwood. There's nothing progressive about that. And so removing that regulation that never had a progressive purpose is not a bad thing.
Yeah. No, it's true. It's a good point. And actually several of my guests have talked about that exact legacy in trying to unpack the origins of this conundrum, this housing affordability conundrum.
Yeah.
It does go back to laws that were passed, fear-based laws that were passed to prevent certain people from living in certain neighborhoods. That's a fact.
Yeah, and as you pointed out in the beginning, there are racial and historic racial and economic prejudice and discrimination is built into this stuff. You look at there's very strong alignment with redlining maps and where single family zones are now.
Yeah.
It's the continuation of those historic patterns of racial and economic segregation.
Yep. And what's crazy about what's happened in our era is that this sort of NIMBY energy has captured a bunch of people who sort of on paper, like they don't agree at all with redlining.
Mm-hmm.
In their soul, like they don't agree with that at all, but they support a policy that is essentially the same thing as redlining for other reasons, like traffic or environmental. That's one of the greatest sort of psychological coups in recent political history, where environmental laws are being used to stop progressive policies like building housing.
Yeah.
We could have a whole 7-episode series about that. I don't want to get into that right now, but it's a crazy dynamic. Last question. This has been a super fascinating conversation. I appreciate everything you shared.
Yeah.
I want to know where this passion came from. Like when you were a kid, did you ever imagine yourself being, a civic activist and running for neighborhood council and running for city council? Like, What's the origin?
Yeah. I was always a political person. I think from a young age, I had like a social justice kind of worldview. It's partly based on my family background. So I'm third generation Ashkenazi, born in New York. My grandma is alive still, 102 years old. And she and my grandpa met at Hunter College in New York City in the sort of like communist circles. Like they described the lunchroom there as, you had like the communists, you had the socialists, and then all the way on the right, you had the Democrats.
Yeah.
That was just the world that they were living in. My grandpa also served in the army, and then they were the consummate American entrepreneurs in a way. They ran a small business side by side for 50 some odd years. But that was their basic value set, was around social justice, around making sure bending the arc of justice, bending the moral arc towards justice. And so my parents were Democrats. I remember rooting for Dukakis when I was a kid. That was the first, I think, election that I was aware of. So I always had that in me. And then, I think just through my life experiences, housing and transportation became the policy areas that I became most passionate about, because I could feel it and touch it and live it. It started out that I just wanted LA to be cooler, to be more engaging and vibrant. And I wanted to be able to get on a train and live the kind of life that I lived in DC. That's the way it started for me. And then as my life progressed, the policy failures became real in my own life. I ended up living in a 1926 bungalow court that was cute from the outside and falling apart, and had to deal with bugs and mold and all of the worst issues. It was really slumlord housing. So I became a victim of the housing crisis. I lived it. We went down to, when I got into a collision, we decided to become a one-car family. Not so much to live my values, but more for economic reasons. And so I began to ride the bus and ride my bike even more, and became even more intimately familiar with the gaps in infrastructure on the ground, and how the way we designed our public realm disproportionately impacted folks in a negative way who weren't able to drive. So all this stuff kind of became real for me. So it was a confluence of things.
Yeah. What a cool story. It goes back, seems like a very long way.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah.
Well, listen, I appreciate what you do around town, and not just with abundant housing, but just being a civic leader. I think you should be applauded for that.
Thank you.
And I want to encourage more people to kind of follow in your footsteps and engage in our democracies in the ways it feels authentic for them, because it's important, and you make a difference as you've proven.
Yeah, and I mean, I hope the listeners will take that to heart. I appreciate the kind words. I think that one thing my life has taught me is, like, at the local level, you can make a tremendous difference. Whether it's like running for your neighborhood council, or becoming an engaged member of Abundant Housing LA, or Streets for All, or working with a direct aid organization that works with unhoused folks. Like, if you don't show up at these meetings, I guarantee you the voices of no are going to be the decision makers. So it really, I hope folks will get engaged locally. It's a great way to make a difference.
Yeah, man. Well said. I feel like the takeaway that I'm getting from talking to people like you who have stepped up into democracy is that it's actually surprisingly similar to entrepreneurship.
Mm-hmm.
It's there's no path, there's no track. And all it takes is a little bit of courage and proactive energy, and you can make a difference right away. Like you proved, your life story, your example proved it. You can win your first election and start changing the culture of your community. And that's the optimistic point, is that even though democracy is kind of daunting and we have problems in this country, it just takes some concerned citizens to step up. We can 100%. Solve them. Yeah.
Go do it. Make your community a better place.
Well, Scott, thank you so much for being here, and
I enjoyed
appreciate your time.
Thank you so much.
Thanks. Thank you for listening to the Nick Halaris Show. We hope you enjoyed the episode and would appreciate your help with spreading the word by sharing with your network on social. And until next time, remember, it's not about pursuing success to unlock fulfillment. It's about learning how to find fulfillment in the midst of success.